Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to wait a few minutes as people join the call. In the meantime, if you want to put your name, last name, an organization, and anything that you're hoping to learn today on the chat. Thank you. Hi, Stephanie. Robert, the question that you just asked on the chat, we're going to get more of that on the webinar on the 30th, which is specifically about DCLA. This one is specific about the New York City budget, which would help you understand when we get to DCLA, but we can talk more about that on the 30th if you join us. I'm going to put the link in a minute to sign up. Hi, Ryan. Shireen, again, similar to the question that Robert asked, sources of funding for cultural organizations. We'll touch a little bit more on the webinar on Monday, March 30th, which is specifically about cultural funding in New York City. This webinar is a little bit more specific about the New York City budget in general. Okay, we're going to start. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gonzalo Casals. I'm co-director of the Cultural and Arts Policy Institute alongside Mauricio Delfin, who's here also on the call. Through research, education, participatory processes, and collaboration, the Institute works to address critical systemic challenges facing New York City's cultural and arts sector. If you're interested in our work, you can sign up on our mailing list through our website. I'll drop the information in the chat. And you also find our contact information. Let me just put that there now. And like I said a few minutes ago, we have a few programs coming up next week, which I'm going to put them on the chat. And maybe Mauricio, as we wait for a few more people to join, do you want to give us a little bit of a sneak preview of what's happening next week?
Sure. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'll be very brief. Next week, we are having our Open Data 101 webinar on Monday at 1 p.m. And it is an introduction specifically directed for arts and culture organizations to explore how open data can help the sector to do a number of things, including improving service delivery, transparency, accountability, and different things like that. And then on Tuesday night, we're having a panel at BRIC. It's called From Open Data to Data Commons, where we're going to be talking about data stewardship. We're going to have Stefan Verhulst from the GovLab, who is an expert in data stewardship and collaborative governance of data infrastructures, do a presentation. And then we are going to present a project we're very excited about, which is called the Culture Data Commons. And the Culture Data Commons is essentially a civic infrastructure to host and share data through a different model, through shared governance. And there's a lot to share with you. And it's also going to be an invitation for arts organizations to join us in that process. So very excited to have you there. There's signups, so Gonzalo just put them on the chat. And if you have any questions, just reach out to me. My email is there as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mauricio. We're going to start. And like I said, if you want to just drop your questions on the chat, I'm going to be checking the chat as we go. But also, we're going to have time for a Q&A all together towards the end of the presentation. Let me share screen. Okay. Let me just move these things around here. So why we think it's important for all of us to understand, how the New York City budget works. So a few reasons. We gave a sneak preview in our social media promotion of the event, right? Number one, if you're interested in policy, budgets are policy documents, and the budget of any city or any government is actually the clearest policy document, right? It shows what New York values, New York City values in this case, what it finds, and what it gets left behind, right? We all see sometimes budgets as sort of boring numbers, on a side, and that don't mean much. But again, right, all the decisions that go into putting a budget together are extremely important, and the delivery of services, the support of the communities that you care about, et cetera, et cetera. If you're an advocate, which I hope many of you are in this call, how can you fight for your community if we don't know how the money is allocated, right? How do you want to make sure to have an impact in the process and the outcome of the budget if you don't know how it works? It's also a tool for oversight, right? Once the budget is created and the government is implementing it and it's starting to spend, how do you make sure that the government is spending the money where they said that they were going to do it, right? Like how do you keep them accountable on the promises that they made? And then the last one is probably the most important, is our money, right? It's tax dollars that are using to provide services to all of us, New York City residents, right? So that's why it's important to understand, to question, because they're shaped by the public. Mhm. The presentation is a lot of numbers and a lot of words, and I recognize that most of our audience here today is arts and culture folks. So I decided to add a few photos here and there from what is called the 1979, New York City Parks Project, which is in 1979, the city was bankrupt. The park system, very much like any other service and system in the city, was broken, and photographers of the New York Times and the Daily News were on a strike, trying to get better pay. And the Parks Department commissioner at that moment decided to hire eight photographers from the New York Times and send them to take photos documented the way that New Yorkers were using their parks. That yield over 3,000 photos, and you're going to be seeing some of those as part of this presentation. I hope makes the presentation a little more interesting. What makes the New York City budget different? Let's take a look a little bit about what do we mean by that. The fiscal year 2027 preliminary budget for New York City is $127 billion. If you're like me, that after a few $1 million, numbers don't make any more sense, right? How do we contextualize this $127 billion? So let's look at, what the budget of other New York State cities look like, right? Excuse me. In this chart, you have the 5 top cities based on their budget size in the state. You clearly see that the budget of New York City's the New York City's budget for fiscal year 23 was a little over $100 billion, and the city that's closest to that is Buffalo with $2.4 billion, right? Then you have Yonkers, you have Rochester, and then Syracuse. So you clearly see that compared to other cities, our budget is much bigger. We usually, when we present numbers, we try to put population next to them as a shorthand for just to give a little bit of context. This is about scale. It's not a perfect sort of an exercise, but it gives you a little bit of an idea, right? Well, it seems that the budget of New York City is so big because population of New York City is over 8 million people, right? So let's compare with other cities in the country and see, how do we compare as a city. Again, top 5 cities by budget size in the country, and New York City still is at the very top. More than double than Los Angeles, almost 4 times bigger than Chicago, and leaving San Francisco and Philadelphia, and number 4, number 5. You still see that a lot of that may have to do with population. It's interesting if you see, we did a calculation also about how much money each of these cities has spent per population, per resident, right? And New York City is almost the most expensive one, with the exception of San Francisco, which we're going to talk in a minute about why is that, why New York City and San Francisco are more expensive. But that gives you a sense around context, how big the city's budget is. Just to have a little more fun, I was like, okay, if it's still the biggest city, how does New York City compare to the budgets of other states? You have California with almost half $500 billion in budget, New York State, Illinois, Texas, Pennsylvania, and New York City would be this, if New York City were to be a state, by the size of its budget, would be the 6th state on the size of the budget. As you notice, I'm using different fiscal years when I look at this information. That is just is the information that is available. But it gives you a sense, right, that New York City still with $100 billion of budget has a budget that is bigger than many of the rest of the states in the U.S. Now, if you want to have more fun, right, you can look at the budgets of countries in the world, and New York City's budget compares to countries like Ireland, Czech Republic, Portugal, and Greece. I'm pushing this comparison because the New York City budget is unique because the way that our city's structure is unique, right? New York City is not just a big city with a lot of residents. In 1898, the city of New York got consolidated to what we call the Greater New York. And the city functions as 5 counties, all under one municipality, right? When you look usually at the sort of administrative structure of states, counties, and cities, usually you have a county that is made out of many cities. In the case of New York, it's the other way around. You have a city that is made out of 5 counties. Why this matters fiscally is because there are 2 main reasons. One is the city government is responsible for a mix of city, county, regional, and state functions, and we're going to go in depth a little bit more, but also has the opportunity, because of that, has the opportunity to collect taxes that no other city does, right? So the city of New York is a municipality, but takes care of the work that other government administrations like a county or a state has. And this makes the city and the budget in a unique position, right? It's a very structurally very powerful, but at the same time, it's structurally very constrained. And let's just quickly go look at what that means. Why is structurally very powerful? Because New York City, unlike any other cities, they have authority the many systems that they provide. They manage the education, they're responsible to manage the education, health. We run hospitals, public safety, housing, social services, and the justice system. And the scale of the budget is so big, and the amount of taxes that it collects is so spread out that it gives them power. In particular, because of the amount of expenses that we have, the contracting power also is important. It shapes markets, institutions, and public authorities. And as a way to explain that a little bit, I was also, again, having a little bit of fun with data. And I was like, what does the top US bus transit systems look like, right? And you have, of course, the MTA New York City bus with almost 6,000 buses. New Jersey Transit, which is statewide, with a little under 3,000, and they keep going down. The New York City yellow buses has, the float is over 10,000 buses. So that gives you an idea of the sheer size of the contracts that the city manage in order to provide some of those services, right? And a clarification, the New York City yellow buses are not owned by the city. The city hires a few companies to provide that service. And all those companies together have, own those buses. Why is it constrained, right? A municipal government with so much power, some would say that they needed to be a little bit constrained, so it doesn't go wrong. And there's a couple of things, couple of policies that regulate, from the state and federal, that regulates the budget of the city. One is the city cannot run deficits, right? Unlike the federal government, unlike the state, the city must balance the budget every year. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but this comes, from that fiscal crisis in the 70s when the city went bankrupt. It cannot borrow also for day-to-day costs, right? We sometimes wanna go out for dinner, wanna have some fun, and we're short on cash. We can always use the credit card. That's something that the city cannot do, right? They can only, and Robert, you were asking this question, the only reason why the city can borrow money is to pay for capital projects. And you would look at the capital projects a little bit like the mortgage that some of us might have, on our home. We borrow money for infrastructure, for what it's called good debt, right? For infrastructure that is going to help us make more money, if you will. And the expense budget, which is what we're talking about now, we pay, that mortgage sort of fee. We pay it every year through the expense budget. And again, right, it's constrained because there's a lot of expense, right? You provide a lot of services. You also have a lot of fixed costs, right? Fixed obligations to pay for those services. That again, other cities usually have the counties or the state pay for that. And just to give you a little bit of the sheer size of those obligations, again, I compare New York City with other municipalities in the country, and I just put the population, and then I put the amount of employee, the public, civil workers, civil servants, employees that the municipality has, and with New York City having almost 55 employees per every 1,000 residents. Just again, give you a sheer size of the scale and the commitments that the city has. I'm gonna take a minute here. I wanna see if there are any questions so far or any comments. I cannot find the chat here, Mauricio. Can you help me? Okay. Here. No questions. Okay, keep going. So the city has what you would call 4 different budgets. The capital budget, which I mentioned before, is the budget that you use to provide infrastructure, to fix buildings, to build new buildings, to build, swimming pools, to buy for ambulances, patrol cars. Any long-term investment in the infrastructure of the city is through that. Many of us in arts and culture are familiar with capital because the city has a program in which gives capital money to nonprofit organizations, in particular culture organizations, to improve, their facilities, to build new facilities. Then you have the expense and revenue budget, which are the budgets that we're most familiar with. And then there is the financial plans. In this conversation, we're going to mostly focus on the expense and revenue budgets. Let's see how they look like, how they work. So where does the money go, right? I told you the budget, the preliminary budget for this year is 127. We're looking now at the budget for the current year, right? And what we did is we look at different categories, the biggest categories, if you will, plus culture and arts and libraries and parks and recreation. And again, to give you a sense, of the scale of these, we decided, to create a chart that for every $100 that the city spends, where those dollars go, right? The biggest expense for the city is education. In this case, education includes both the Department of Education, public schools, plus the city pays for the community colleges at CUNY. The rest of the colleges are paid by the state, but with the Department of Education taking 99% of these $31 for every $100. The next expense is social and health services, hospitals, DYCD, the Department of Youth and Community Services, all social services and health services that the city provide. Government operations, how much money the government needs to spend in order to run as a government and provide all these services. Fixed obligations. These fixed obligations is basically the pensions of all those city employees that I showed you before. Debts that the city has, and a couple of other smaller items. Public safety and justice, fire, police, some of the justice system that the city pays for. Infrastructure environment, this is sanitation, the Department of Environmental Protection, just sort of, and then, I jump into areas that are sort of similar to the work what we do, out of, every $100 that the city spends, they spent, 58 cents in parks and recreation, 44 cents in libraries, and 25 cents in culture and arts. And I just want to, I didn't have time to fix this morning. I want to clarify that, the 25 cents that they spend in culture and arts is what they spend on the Department of Cultural Affairs. The city spends under money in culture and arts, and we're going to talk more about that when we talk about specific cultural funding on March 30th. So that's a little bit, how the expense budget distributes money across different areas of the city. I'm not sure it's more importantly, but like the revenue budget, where the money comes from. And I'm sure you have heard lately, because we're knee deep in the budget process, and the city is facing steep deficits, because the city cannot run deficits, they need to figure out new ways or different ways to bridge the gap. The current mayor decided that, there's two ways and you reach a deficit: you spend less or you raise more money, right? We all have to do that in our organizations. This mayor decided that, he wanted to prioritize raising the revenue. So let's look at about the opportunities that a mayor has to raise the revenue in order to pay for all the services that we demand as New Yorkers. There are three main sources of revenue. One is taxes. We're going to talk about that in a second in the next two slides. The other one is through state and federal grants. The state gives money to the cities, to the municipalities to do different work, the same as the federal government. And then there's a couple of other city revenues. An example I was reading this morning that Amazon owes almost $10 million to the city on fines and tickets that their trucks were given because of leaving the trucks idle, right? While they were delivering stuff, right? So a lot of these other city revenues is money they collect through tickets and a couple of other items. Again, what we're looking at that here is just to simplify a little bit, understand, the scale of this is for every $100 that the city collects, 69 come from taxes, 25, from federal and state grants, and $6 from those revenues. When you look at taxes, and again, this is very much on everybody's mind these days because we're in the city and the state are in a push and pull, how we go about this. I divided the taxes that the city collect in two groups. One is taxes that the city collect, but the rate is set by the New York State. That means that these are taxes that they come to the city. However, in order to change the rate to charge more or to charge less, the city needs to go to the New York State and ask them to make those changes. One of them is personal income tax. Again, for every $100, $16 come from personal income tax. That's the tax we all pay for the money we make. We usually pay that in most municipalities and states, right? You pay at the municipal level, state level, and then federal government. Then you have a general sales tax. When we buy stuff, there's a tax that we pay with that. There's a tax every time that you get a mortgage. And then a recently newer tax is the money that cannabis dispensaries make. They pay a tax that goes to the state, and the state gives a percentage to the municipalities. Again, if the mayor of the city of New York would want to collect more money through these taxes, they will have to go to the state and say, we need to raise the taxes, which is exactly what's happening now. Mayor Mandani wants to raise revenue by increasing personal income tax of what he calls the richest New Yorkers, folks that make over $1 million a year. In order to do that, he had to talk to the governor, and there's a push now by the state legislator to ask the governor to raise those taxes. These are city taxes, same as the other ones, but the mayor gets to control. The city gets to control, not the mayor, gets to control, how much we collect from that. And I said the city because the mayor needs to ask the city council to change these taxes, right? You heard the mayor saying, if the governor doesn't increase the taxes on rich New Yorkers, then I won't have any other alternative to increase the property tax. As you can see, for every $100, The city collects $30 and almost $30 in property tax. These are the taxes that property owners pay every year based on the value of their property. This not only affects property owners that would get a tax hike, then would transfer, that hike if they're renting, they're renting their homes to tenants, they would just raise, the rent, and it would just create, sort of a compounded, increase of the cost of living of all New Yorkers. Corporate taxes, this one is important because we are in a city with a lot of corporations, mostly, when you look at Wall Street, and then unincorporated taxes, this is for partnerships and other models of, businesses. And then you have other smaller taxes. So we were talking about the city budget being constrained, right? Only, if you look at here, only 43%, only 43% of $43 per $100 of revenue, the city can control how much they charge in taxes. The other almost 60% is controlled by the state. This is the part that I think is most important because is, what the process of coming up with that budget looks like, and what are the opportunities in which we all have to influence those changes. There's no presentation on the New York City budget that doesn't show this photo. This is, I mentioned this before. This is when the city was bankrupt, went to the federal government and said, I need a bailout. And, President Ford said, no, we're not going to give you a bailout. And the Daily News, came up with this sort of infamous headline that says Ford to the city and drop dead. And very much after that, a lot of, policies and laws were changed that, regulate a little bit more how the city manages its budget. The adopted budget, which is the actual budget that we all look at and we'll work with, covers one fiscal year that goes from July 1st to July 30th. And it's built or created through different players, right? The mayor, who is the executive branch, develops the budget, says, this is all the expenses we have, this is all the revenues we have, and just put it on the table, right? They do that by assuming revenue assumptions, how the economy is going to look like, what are the trends, in property taxes, income tax, you name it, what are the different ways in which we can make money? Then puts it on the table and negotiates with the council, right? Once the budget is approved by the council, then, you have to manage it, right? As the executor of the budget. Make sure that you're not spending more than what you promise, that you're spending where you promise, and that the revenue assumptions that you made are being met. And if that doesn't happen, then, you get to propose changes during the year. The council, as our direct representation of New Yorkers, they review the budgets that the mayor put together. They negotiate with the mayor and said, you want to put more money in safety, but we think you should put more money on, health, or, you should put more money on arts and culture, right? There's a little bit of a back and forth that I'm gonna explain in a minute how it works. And then the council, once they agree with the mayor, they need to vote the budget in order for the mayor to go and then implement it. There's the controller. The controller makes sure that the city finances are running well through audits, auditing agencies, auditing contracts, tracking fiscal risks, right? Recently, our current controller went to a hearing in the city council and said, you know, the mayor is saying that we're going to make all these, we're making all these assumptions about income coming in. We think that, you know, he's being a little too optimistic about the economy in the country. I think, you know, they should just pull back a little bit those revenue assumptions if they want to have, you know, a balanced budget, right? It's almost like you're a CFO, if you will, in your organization. Probably one of my favorite city agencies, the Independent Budget Office. It's an office that was created, I believe it was in the 90s, which is, as the title says, is independent. And their sole role is to have an independent analysis of the budget, right? At every step of the way of the budget, from, you know, what's proposed to what's adopted, to the changes that are being made, you know, in terms to be balanced. You have an office that is exclusively in charge of making sure all those decisions are based, you know, on factual information. What also makes it a really interesting agency and that I like it so much is that you can not only, this information is not only shared with, you know, elected officials and, you know, government and municipal workers, but any of us can go to the agency and ask questions about the budget. I do it almost all the time, and it's great to work with them. Then you have a watchdog groups. Probably one that comes to mind is the Citizens Committee, Citizens Budget Committee, which is almost like a version of IBO, but, you know, it's a nonprofit organization whose work is to make sure that we all in New York City, all residents understand, you know, what's happening with the budget. And then in particular, all of us, right, the culture and arts sector, because we do receive funding for our culture organizations, because we care about arts and culture in the city, right? We get involved in advocating for funding and policy priorities. We make sure that the city council and the administration understand where the needs are and where there are gaps in service. We also show how the budget affects cultural life, right? If you're going to cut the budget, these are the 5 things that are going to happen, and this is how it's going to impact the life of New Yorkers. We get organized and we testify in front of the city council, and then we hold the government accountable. I'm sure many of you heard people talk about the budget dance. If you don't know what it looks like, this is exactly how it looks like. This is almost a typical year on the budget process of the city of New York. I decided it was important to start, you know, in October. By October 1st, if you have a good federal government, not the case these days, you have you start the fiscal year with the federal budget already in place. As probably all of you know, there has been a lot of back and forth between, you know, the two parties, and there are portions of the budget that are still not approved. By November, the mayor looks at the current budget that started in July 1st. They look at, you know, the revenues. They look at, you know, how much money is coming from the federal government. And they say, you know, okay, we're fine. We're not going to have a deficit this year. We keep going. Or if they project a deficit, then start making decisions about, you know, where can they save money or how they can raise revenue. Then, you know, in mid-January, the mayor puts together what's called the preliminary budget. Like I said, the preliminary budget for next year, starting in July 1st this year, is $127 billion. He goes and presents this budget to the city council. The city council takes the budget, has a whole bunch of folks at the council looking at the budget and analyzing every cent. And then they do what is called the budget hearings, which for the arts and culture is on Wednesday. At those budget hearings, they ask questions to the commissioners of the different agencies in charge of different parts of the budget. And then it's open to what is called public testimony, in which many of us go and testify how we feel about the budget. Are we getting enough money for arts and culture? Should we increase, different aspects of the budget for arts and culture and decrease others? You name it. With all that information, the city council, comes up with a response to the mayor on the preliminary budget. And then the mayor, by not later than May, in April 26th, technically, presents an executive budget. The mayor says, okay, I heard all of you. I also had enough time now to see how revenues are going to look like in the coming year, where the expenses should be, how much things are going to cost. This is the budget that I would like you, city council, to approve so I can start using it in July 1st. There's another round of budget hearings and negotiation starts, right? And there's back and forth, behind the scenes between the mayor and the city council. The city council has what's called a budget negotiation team, which is a few council members in charge of negotiating with the administration to make sure the priorities of New Yorkers are represented in that budget. You have a new set of hearings. This is, where many of you are called to join us in a rally at City Hall and make sure that we show to the City Council that arts and culture is important to New Yorkers. So they see it as a priority and they push back. Ideally, by early June, you have an adopted budget. Sometimes, there's disagreement between the council and the mayor, and the budget doesn't get approved until June 30th. By law, we need to have an adopted budget approved by July 1st. I don't remember in my almost 25 years living in New York that the budget has been adopted much later than July 1st, but I may be mistaken. We're almost done. So what's the logic behind then the New York City budget, right? With all these components. Basically budgeting, when you budget for your personal expenses, but also when you budget for your organizations, it's about trade-offs, right? There's usually never enough money to fund every priority or to provide every tax reduction, right? Ideally, we would love a government that doesn't take much money from our taxes, but that at the same time provides services for all of us in the city. Balancing that out is basically the name of the game, right? Every budget is a set of choices, right? There's competing demands from agencies, advocates, communities, and the public in general, right? And there's only so much money, right? So how do you make those choices? Well, those choices are both fiscal and political, right? On one way, they need to make sense financially, but on the other way, what is the political pressure that different groups put in order to get the services that they want? When the budget is approved, but modifications need to happen. We have seen that happening a couple of years ago, the Adams administration. Then, you have a little bit of the same situation, right? And a series of negotiations and saying, we need to cut the budget. This is where we feel like we need to cut. And there's pressure by the city council and advocates to make sure that those cuts, do not affect the basic services that New Yorkers spend. When revenues exceed, you can certainly lower taxes. I don't think that has ever happened, at least at the city level. The federal government does it a lot. But the city has the opportunity to preserve funds for future, right? Just to have reserves. And that's something that the Adams administration wasn't that good at. and has put us in this fiscal crisis, if you will, that we're expecting now. And then you have to be careful, right? There's opportunities that you have non-recurring revenues. And how do you use those to support recurring spending, right? One-time money that comes to you, that then you put it towards something that should be recurring, and then you have no money in years after that to support that. An example of that was both during the fiscal crisis of 2008, but also during the COVID-19. It was an influx of money from the federal government, and just to make sure that those funds were to provide relief, but not necessarily were counted as recurring revenues, because it was very clear that it was a one-time thing. Last but not least, while we think that budget literacy is not just about knowing where the money goes, but it's also, at the end of the day, the budget is a means to something, right? Not an ends. And that means is if the government is achieving, with the resources in control, the things that we want government to do, right? It's not only about a balanced budget, but it's what is it that you're doing with those dollars that we gave you, how efficient you are with those, and how the systems, the services that you provide with those dollars are reaching the people that need to reach, and they're covering the issues that we want you to do that. That's the presentation for today. I'm gonna open it for Q&A.